Awesome. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another escarpment webinar series. Today we have Jeremy. We can see right here on the screen. Jeremy is one of the co-founders of Barncat Ales, and today we're going to be talking about hazy beers with him. For those who don't know, Barncat Ales was founded in 2016 in Cambridge, Ontario, by Matt, the other business partner, and Jeremy we have here. And they're best known for being a very small brewery and making big New England IPA style beers. They're some of the first people that really kind of nailed down the style. Some of the first people some of the first beers of the style that I had, and I was really kind of taken back by it. So today we're just going to talk about New England IPAs, how they approach it, what ingredients they focus on, what processes they look for, how they really pull off these high-end IPAs, a little bit on haze and how they kind of help factor that into their recipes, and then just kind of open it up for Q&A at the end. This is the first version of this where it's a bit more of a podcast style, and typically we've gone through a bit more of a lecture, so we have a hiccup or two. Forgive us, it's the first one. And with that, Jeremy, I'm going to let you kind of start it off. Tell us about you guys.
Okay,
Who is Barncat?
Sure. Like Nate mentioned, we opened in 2016 from Cambridge, Ontario. We actually just passed our 4th year anniversary back at the beginning of April. Like he said, it is myself and Matt. And we brew small batches. We're brewing like 600 liters at a time. Sometimes we'll do a double batch, so we'll have 1,200. So it is still pretty small. And yeah, we've been brewing hazy IPAs since the day we opened back in 2016. And before that, it's a style I've been brewing as a home brewer as far back as late 2013. So we've got a lot of experience with the style. And yeah, I've just been doing it for quite a while. So,
all right. And I didn't know you from my home brewing days, but I knew Matt from my home brewing days, and we used to work together at a former brewery I'm not going to mention. But I remember him getting another Cambridge brewery. I remember him getting really excited at one point when he was telling me about these new weird Vermont style IPAs. I'm like, what are you going on about? I have no idea. And here we are. And now it's a beer style everyone loves. So, I want to get a bit more in depth on this thing. So we'll just kind of start it off with kind of how you approach it. When it comes to the main ingredients like hops, water, malt, yeast strain, how do you guys really approach this? We'll kind of go one by one. Let's kind of start with malts. Like where do you guys really, what are you looking for when it comes to malts for these styles of beers? You guys make a series of different types of New England IPA, varying strengths and things like that. Does the malt bill change a lot? Is it really consistent? Is it kind of the same thing that you just kind of push and pull? Is it, do you use torrefied versus flaked grains versus malted grains? Like how do you go about choosing which one of these you're working with?
Yeah, we have a few different kind of like base recipes that we kind of dialed in over the years and what we like. In general, I would say pretty much all of our IPAs and double IPAs would be two-row, oat malt, and dextrin malt. We have another version where we take some of the two-row out and replace it with wheat. But otherwise, yeah, that's pretty standard. And then just like a double IPA, a little bit more grain and some corn sugar. And like pale ale would just be, subtract some. So that's kind of what we do. It's typically always those three. So
that's just kind of a pale malt, wheat, oat malt, and
dextrin malt.
Dextrin malt. So I've seen some people have issues when they start looking at their malts as if, like when you're scaling a recipe, you almost have two options. You can either take everything as a percentage, or you can just increase, say, just your base malt. So like, right. And this has caused some brewers I know to have problems where they effectively have too much protein. If you've ever had a New England IPA where it almost looks like a snow globe inside, where it's like chunks of protein instead of a nice stable haze, that's often attributed to having too much protein. So when you guys are scaling this, or have you ever encountered that, or when you're scaling recipes, are you just scaling the the barley portion of that, or is it everything at an equal percentage?
I would say in general, we kind of scale things based on sacks or half sacks. So a lot of things are not exactly like scaled up. It'll just be to the next sack of grain.
All right.
So something like a pale ale and a double IPA both get 1 sack of dextrin malt.
Okay. So it's kind of.
So yeah, it's not evenly scaled. It's a lot of times it's just kind of based on convenience.
Okay. So do you not find a huge amount of variation amongst those different types of scaling for it? Like, do you see huge swings in in flavor based on the malts? Like I ask this because some brewers focus immensely on their malts when it comes to this style of beer, even though it is a hop focused beer. While other brewers don't seem to, it's kind of like three sheets to the wind with it. And you seem a bit more on the latter end of that.
Yeah, it's not really something we noticed in the final beer. Definitely, so double IPAs are the only thing. They get 2 sacks of oat malt. And I'd say the hot break in the kettle is humongous. It looks like golf ball sized chunks of break floating around in the kettle. That's where we really notice it. But in the final beer, we don't seem to really notice much of a difference.
All right, that makes a lot of sense. I've seen that at the college. It's really entertaining. You did notice that you have 2 different kind of base recipes, one that has wheat and one that doesn't. What's the, when you guys are kind of conceptualizing a recipe, what makes you choose one over the other? Like what does the wheat bring to the table that the non-wheated one doesn't?
To be honest, I don't notice a humongous difference. Sometimes it's just kind of how we feel, or if we look at the pile of grain and we say, oh, we don't have enough 2-row, let's throw some wheat in it instead. So honestly, sometimes that's what it comes down to.
I dig it. I know some brewers are meticulous for this stuff, and I very much so appreciate the convenience factor of this. Like, I always kind of drives me a little crazy when I see some brewers going, this, I'm going to use 400 of the 450 grams out of this bag of hops. Like, no, just add the whole bag of hops, and this is silly. Just add the whole thing.
Exactly. We very much subscribe to that ideology.
All right, cool. So with that as kind of a nice segue, let's chat about hops. This is probably going to be the bulk of today, so we're probably going to cycle around it a few times. But what hops do you guys like? How much hop variety do you use when it comes to kind of effort and labor? Is this where you guys really kind of pour like sweat over the details, or is, how do you guys handle it? How do you approach it?
Yeah, for hops, we basically just kind of stick to what works. Like IPA hops, like, certain hops are popular in IPAs for a reason, right? It's because they work. Yeah. So yeah, we just kind of stick to the main ones. I recently heard Scott from Dominion City refer to certain hops as luxury hops. So we pretty much just stick to those hops. All our IPAs are luxury hops. The Citra, Mosaic, Nelson, Galaxy.
The expensive one.
Yeah, exactly. You just don't look at your hop bill.
Okay. Yeah. Well, you mean the actual, like, the amount of money for the hops? Not the
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. You don't look at the invoice when it comes in. You don't really think too much about that. But yeah, so we just kind of stick to ones that we know work. And we're never going to be kind of a brewery that kind of jumps on brand new hops right away. I kind of like to let other people play around with them first, and then we can try their beers and be like, oh, this new hop is awesome. And we'll, start integrating that into our beers also. Okay.
So that's one of the questions I had for you regarding this. So you're never, will you do test batches with certain hops? Right. I know some breweries, they'll take, say, you guys don't really have like a base beer. Like, I know most breweries, if you go to Great Lakes, they have Canuck. So if they want to try a new hop, they'll take some Canuck off and then dry hop that in a separate tank to test out a new hop variety. You guys, I'm guessing, don't really do things like that.
No, we don't really have a great way to do that, unfortunately. Like, we have a couple old homebrew systems there, and initially we were like, oh, we'll just brew some homebrew batches occasionally and play around with. And it's like, in the end, it's just not worth the effort. We might as well be brewing time for that. Yeah, we might as well be brewing a 600-liter batch anyway. I mean, that's basically home brewing anyway. So.
Yeah, you're not. You guys are in this weird position where it's like 600 liters is definitely a microbrewery, but it's just north of.
Right. Yeah. Not much.
Yeah. Exactly.
But I would say it is a fun size because it does let us play around with like full batches of beer, and then worst case scenario, if you get one that doesn't quite turn out as well, it's not a major loss.
Yeah. That's absolutely. There's definitely benefits to that.
Yeah.
We're going to cycle back to hops again. So, and I know probably a lot of the questions are all going to be about hops, and I have more questions for you about hops, but I want to keep this kind of going through.
Yeah. Okay.
Some breweries stress immensely out about their water for New England IPAs. Do you guys? Do you guys do any sort of water alteration? Are you trying to push your water to do certain things for you, or?
So this might be a bit of a controversial opinion, but I don't think water is all that important for this style of IPA.
Really?
We use Cambridge city water. It's not particularly great.
It's incredibly hard.
Yeah, it's very hard. So we remove the chlorine, obviously. We'll add a bit of gypsum. We have to use a fair bit of phosphoric acid to drop the mash pH, but
Okay.
otherwise we don't play around with the water too much.
Okay. Have you, so, and I don't know I'm just kind of thinking of this offhand. If you look at the classic different types of New England style breweries, you get it, like they're adding tons and tons of hard minerality to the water, tons, like large volumes of it.
Right.
They're almost trying to replicate Cambridge water.
Yeah, the city just adds it for us.
Yeah. I'm curious if you were to move the production of this beer style somewhere else, that you'd start having problems with it. Just because that seems, Cambridge almost has like the Alchemist's water profile, one of these like kind of big Nipa brewery water profiles we essentially already have in the area.
So that was one of the things we kind of found earlier on. So coming from, like, I was brewing this style of beer at home, using completely different water. So that was one of our earlier challenges, just kind of figuring out what works with the new water. But in the end, sorry?
And did you have to do much alteration, or did you notice things actually change in flavor profile or not?
When we started doing less with it, actually, is when things started being better. Like, so.
Huh. Okay. I have this question later on, but I think we'll go through it now. When it comes to kind of control points for your brewing process, like, are you guys, in regards to water, are you really focusing on pH? I know some breweries will dwell massively over pH, and like we've had some clients where they've had success trying to increase the amount of haze present by trying to shift the pH to denature certain enzymes or make certain enzymes less active during the mash. Do you guys do anything like that? You mentioned that you're adding phosphoric to drop the pH, but is that a fine control? Are you shooting for exactly like finely controlled numbers, or is it kind of more nebulous?
So our target with that is, for mash pH, we want to be between 5.4 and 5.6 at room temperature.
Okay.
A little on the low side is fine. Like, we found if it dips below 5.4, it's fine still. Try to never be above 5.6.
Okay. And what happens if you get above that?
That's when you start getting beers that are a lot darker. Like, if you've ever seen somebody use like really, really hard water and not treat the mash water to drop the pH, then you end up with like a much darker beer. You don't get that like sort of bright yellow beer, and it kind of muddles the flavor. It kind of muddles the flavors, I think, of the hops a little bit.
Yeah, I would agree. Have you ever experimented going on the opposite direction, kind of over acidifying a beer and seeing what would happen with it? Like, if your mash pH is like 5.1, 5.0 or something like that, have you ever had a beer go that way?
We have had them drop a little bit below 5.4, like 5.2, 5.3, never quite down to 5. Haven't really found too much of a difference in the final beer. So.
All right. So as long as you're below 5.4, you guys have had a lot of success with incredibly hard Cambridge water.
As long as we're below 5.6, we're good.
All right. Awesome. And this is one that I think you might be a little guarded on, but Yeast Strain. And I think I might speak a little bit more on this, but what impact do you find that your yeast strain plays on this? You guys have a little bit of a proprietary strain that you guys use.
So I think yeast is actually the most important part of making this style of beer.
In what way? So, like, if you're to shift the yeast, what elements do you typically find are present or no longer present?
Well, so right off the bat, certain yeasts just don't work to make this style of beer. Like, you can't use any sort of ale yeast.
Okay.
And the next thing I find is the texture of the beer is humongously impacted by the yeast. Something we're really going for is like a really, really soft texture in the beer, and I think you just don't get that with certain yeasts.
Okay. Can you? So have you guys done the side by side with this? I remember I had a West Coast IPA last time I was at your place, and that was just Cali, or a Cali analog, and
yeah.
it was much sharper. It was much cleaner. Was that just like the same process for New England IPA, but just different yeast strain?
It was similar. Grain bill was a little different. That double IPA was just 2-row and dextrose.
Oh, okay.
Otherwise, we kind of handled it the same way, but yeah, it was California ale yeast as opposed to our normal ale yeast. So otherwise, the approach was pretty similar. It was still dry hopped exactly the same how we would do like a New England style IPA. So
okay. We're going to get into that. For anyone who's itching to hear about that, we're going to get into that because I have many questions about this as well.
Sure.
That kind of covers the base just kind of like in selection of ingredients, but I want to really get into when it comes to processing, which is kind of, how you guys actually handle stuff in the brew house. So we'll kind of start from beginning of the process to the end. Are you guys doing any, I know some breweries will try to really push like a protease rest or a peptidase rest to try and alter the haze composition of this beer. How are you guys mashing these beers? Is it just a simple like 66 degrees Celsius single infusion with mash out? Is it, what do you guys approach? What have you found works well or what doesn't work well when it comes to the mashing process for this style?
Yeah, we just do a single infusion. We use Fahrenheit actually, so I'll tell you in Fahrenheit. I don't really know what it translates into Celsius, but we shoot for like 154-ish, 155, kind of mid 150s for mash temperature.
Okay. Yeah, 66, 67 degrees C, I think.
Probably pretty standard mash temperature, like not high or low really, just right in the middle. And then for sparging, we'll just increase the temperature of the sparge water to 170, and then just do it like a pretty standard fly sparge.
So one of the things that I've also heard from breweries when it comes to this entire topic is that the mash out temp or the sparge temp can actually have a big impact. Have you guys had any sort of issues with that or not? Like, have you noticed anything regarding sparge temperatures or mash out temperatures or things like that? Sorry, I got ahead of myself. Do you guys mash out or is it just increase in temp due to sparging?
Just increase due to sparging.
Okay.
But yes, to go back to your previous question, we definitely have noticed, like earlier on, we would use a hotter sparge water, and we found it actually made the beer a little bit maybe astringent. So keeping it down at 170 has been like a bigger improvement that way, making sure we don't go higher than that.
Right. So some people have argued, and this is something that you see with Pilsners, which we'll talk about in a Pilsner session for Escarpment Will. We're lining that up now, actually. But the mash out has the ability to kind of pull more proteins and dextrins and things that are able to give body to a beer that aren't broken down. So there seems to be some sort of correlation here that I'm hoping when we kind of another one of these with another hazy brewer, we can kind of get more feedback on. Because the mash out temp does seem to have seems to have an impact on this. We're going to get probably into the meat and potatoes, so to speak, of all of this, but how do you guys work with hops? How much are you adding? When are you adding them? Why are you adding this? How do you make decisions as to when you're adding hops? Like what do you guys typically do for your IPAs in regards to handling hops?
Okay, so I guess we'll start with hot side. So one thing we found going back to our water is something about that water really accentuates bitterness. So we have to be very careful that we don't make the beer too bitter in the kettle. So a lot of times all we'll do is like a whirlpool addition. Double IPAs might get a little bit at the start of the boil. We're talking like a tiny bit, like half a pound at the start of the boil, and we'll do like 4 or 5 pounds in the whirlpool. Just to be clear, the batch size is 600 liters, right? Yeah, 600. This is like our standard size is 600 liters. Yeah. Okay. So almost everything at the whirlpool. How are you determining how much you're adding in? Do you guys have some sort of standard scaling amount, like for every degree Plato you're adding X amount of hops, or is it more so this gets this many bags of hops because it's convenience? No, well, like I mean, in those quantities, it's all less than a bag of hops because we're buying hops in 5 kilogram bags. So it's just been kind of trial and error. It's like double IPAs will get this much, IPA will get this much, and then pale ale gets this much, and it's just amounts we've found, doing this over and over and over again that work well for us. So we were talking about this before, kind of in the green room area before we got into this, but you guys wouldn't exactly describe yourself as a science-driven brewery. No, we're a lot more art than science, I think. Yeah. And just working, doing, we get to brew these like a lot of times, so we've got a lot of practice doing it. So we just have seen so many different versions of these beers. We kind of are able to like hone in on what works well for us. Okay. So one other thing, just kind of riff off that I've seen some facilities have problems with is reproducibility. Even though they are making the same beer over and over and over again, how much of an issue have you guys noticed from that standpoint? Like, are you guys constantly changing every single time? So the idea of the goal is not reproducibility, or is like if you follow the same process or the same steps in your facility, are you getting different beers or something that's rather similar to the prior batch? I would say for the most part, it's fairly repeatable. The thing for us is we don't really have any flagships. We do like remake beers quite frequently, but it's never back to back. So if there is a little bit of batch variation, the previous time we made it might be like 3 months ago. So you're probably not going to like be able to notice a tiny little difference versus like drinking the same beer and then the next week drinking the next batch of that beer. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. That's something that you see a lot of breweries do. That's kind of for anyone who's a home brewer here, that's kind of a dirty secret for a lot of pro brewers, is that if you don't make the batch back to back, you can't compare it.
Right, exactly.
That's kind of the dirty secret to the brewing industry.
And there are a few things that are outside of our control. Definitely you see variability in hops. You might get the same hops, but like this crop of Citra you get is not as good as the previous one, or vice versa. So there is variability there, and that's just something that's out of our hands, really. So we kind of embrace it a little bit. Yeah,
you have to. You don't have a choice to do anything other than that.
Yeah,
like I know some hop forward beers that are in industry are, how to put this? They're the same brand, but there's no consistency, so to speak. The only thing that's consistent is the label on the can. That's it.
Yeah, it can happen for sure.
Yeah. So we're going to start to get a bit more into the weeds in regards to what you guys do in order to kind of ensure kind of higher quality and not consistency, but things that you guys focus on in order to make sure your beers taste good. Like I'm sure everyone here has had New England style IPAs that have just been bad or boring or just fusel alcohol bombs or just flabby and not really have that big juice kind of tropical kick to whatever they're going for. So we're going to kind of start jumping into that. One of the things we've worked with a few different clients on it with this is hop contact time. Do you guys have any sort of CCPs or critical control points in regards to hop usage or knockout times or things like that in regards to the process to ensure that these beers turn out?
Are we talking like hot side, cold side, or both?
Both.
Okay. Yeah.
Like what can happen to cause errors in this style of beer?
I think in terms of errors, it's more sort of cold side, but we'll talk a little bit about hot side. So like I said, it's typically just like either no 60-minute addition or a small one, and then whirlpool. We have like a standard time, like we whirlpool for, typically 10 minutes. We'll let it rest for 10 minutes and then start cooling it out into the tank. And then cold side would be, dry hopping. We have like a few procedures that we've kind of developed that I think work really well for us. So we can delve into that a little bit more if you'd like.
All right. Yeah, let's go into it. Let's jump in.
So for dry hopping, the way we do it is just one big dry hop typically. We dry hop for 4 days. The big thing for us is we only dry hop with freshly opened bags of hops. So you'll open the bag of hops and then less than 5 minutes later, it's in the beer.
Okay.
Sorry?
No, keep going.
So then that kind of determines our dry hop amounts because we're buying hops in 5 kilogram bags. So that's kind of how we work. Like it either gets 1 bag, 2 bags, 3 bags, 4 bags, etc. So we kind of play it that way.
Is there kind of a scale on that where let's say the pale ale gets 1, the IPAs get 2 to 3, and the double IPAs get 4?
Yeah, there is a scale. So for 6-hect batch, pale ale typically would get 1 5 kilogram bag.
Okay.
An IPA or double IPA, we actually dry hop them the same amount. They both get 10 kilograms. We've done a few double IPAs that get 15, but at that point you're getting like pretty excessive amount of hops. And then we've done a triple IPA. We did a 600 liter batch of triple IPA that we did a 20 kilogram dry hop, which was a little bit excessive.
We're going to talk about beer losses due to hop additions near the end, but that's going to come up.
That's a good way to achieve a lot of beer loss, but with dry hopping that much.
Yeah.
So we typically don't dry hop in that scale.
All right. One thing we've talked about prior for this is regards to the dry hop conditions. So you guys, I know some brewers are looking to add the dry hops in the middle of fermentation to kind of really try and emphasize bioconversion and things like that. We just had a whole a whole webinar on this.
Yep.
How do you guys handle dry hopping? And I also, if you can kind of mention about how you guys handle yeast cropping as well, because one of the other big one of the big issues with brewing this style commercially is yeast management, and you guys seem to have this on point. You know, a lot of breweries struggle with trying to get enough yeast off the batch they're working with before they add their dry hop into it. Because as soon as you add the dry hop to that beer, you really shouldn't be harvesting the yeast off that thing.
Yep. So that's actually exactly like you said. Those two things are definitely intertwined. We've tried dry hopping during fermentation before. For a few reasons, we don't really like it. So it's not something we do. We actually always dry hop post fermentation, which allows us to harvest yeast.
So is it several days after fermentation? Are you cold crashing the beer completely and then dry hopping? Or are you partially cold crashing, which you see a lot of breweries do? Like how do you go about the finesse about adding all these things?
Yeah, so we typically dry hop on day 6, and the day before we'll do a soft crash. We drop it from, again, I'm going to talk in Fahrenheit, but we ferment at 68. We'll ramp up to 72 right at the end of fermentation, and then the day before we dry hop, we'll do kind of a soft cold crash down to 59, which allows us to harvest yeast a bit better, and that's also our dry hop temperature.
So for people who are metric, they're going from 20 to 22 to 15.
Yeah.
Do you find if you kind of soft crash? I know some breweries they've soft crashed their beer for 2 to 3 days and they started to have problems. Do you just hold that for 24 hours or do you do it for longer? Is this kind of a turnover issue? Like if in a perfect world, would you alter this protocol at all, or is it simply the same across the board no matter what, and this is the best way to do it?
That's something we've kind of but we never used to do that before, and then we've started, and then that's just something we do now. It seems to work really well for us. Like I said, that's our dry hop temperature. So we'll do the soft cold crash for 1 day, pull the yeast, and then we're dry hopping at that point, and we keep it that temperature throughout the duration of the dry hop.
Okay. Are you guys adding spunding valves or things like that? So like when you start doing the partial crash, is that beer completely fermented out, or is it still have a little bit of gravity left in it?
We don't spund them. We only spund lagers, but
okay.
So what we do in terms of process is, I think it's probably the 5th day after we brew the beer, I'll close the tank, and it's basically completely fermented out at that point, but it gives us enough that it'll build maybe 4 or 5 psi in the tank. That way, when we soft crash it, we still have positive pressure and enough to like push out the yeast after also. Yeah,
that makes sense. Have you guys ever had any issues in regards to dry hopping with hop creep? The phenomenon where you see glucoamylase, which we're going to have a whole webinar on this at a later point, everyone, by the way, about hop creep and the glucoamylase derived from hops and things like that. Have you ever had any issue with that in regards to overcarbonation in beers due to it?
So that's one of the reasons for this, like for holding at the soft crash temperature, because I've heard actually holding at that temperature will sort of help prevent that from happening.
Yep.
Whether or not it does happen, it's not something we ever check for, and we've never really seen any ill effects from that. So it's not something we've ever been concerned with. Okay.
When just so I kind of have an idea from a process standpoint, how dry are your beers typically getting? Like I know some breweries really focus for their pale ales to get down to like 1 or 2 degrees Plato, 1004 to 1008. Sorry, 2 to 2.5 degrees Plato. So that's 1008 to about 1010 gravity.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk in specific gravity here because that's what we use. So I would say for something like a pale ale, we typically target about 1012.
Okay.
An IPA is somewhere in the 1015 range, and then double IPAs would fall typically somewhere between 1015 and 1020.
All right. So there is a little bit of like if you were to can this beer and sit on it for a while, there is a potential risk of those things. And you had hop creep induced. There's a little bit of chance of this having some re-fermentation on it.
It's possible. I've never seen it. The issue is people actually hold on to our cans for a lot longer than I would like them to sometimes, and I've never heard of any issues. Somebody opened one of our triple IPAs recently that was about a year old, and it didn't seem to have any sort of ill effects in terms of like overcarbonation or anything in the can. I'm sure it wasn't the freshest beer ever, but yeah, so we haven't really seen any issues there.
All right, that's a perfect segue to the next thing I wanted us to kind of talk about. This style is notorious, absolutely notorious for having oxidation issues. So you mentioned you build up about 4 psi in the fermenter just to help scrub off a little bit of potential oxygen. Well, sorry, when I think of that, my initial thought was to help scrub off some oxygen egress that might happen. How do you guys handle oxygen? Like you guys can a lot of stuff. Well, we can some things. Is that external canning? Do you check DO levels? Are you on that stuff like a hawk, or is it? Do you find it to be massively impactful, or is it kind of something else that goes in?
It's something we're very conscious of. Like, we want to minimize oxygen in every step of the process, obviously. So anytime you're opening the tank, you're risking like oxygen getting in. So for instance, the way we dry hop is we just have dry hop ports on the top of the tank. So we're opening them up and dumping hops in. But at the same time, we'll be blasting CO2 through the spray ball the whole time, making sure to sort of minimize oxygen exposure there. And then the next one for bright tank, we just like really purge the bright tank a lot. Like when we think it's been purged enough, we keep purging it more. So we don't actually have a way to test DO, but when we have mobile canners in, we do get the test reports. I actually have one right here that I was kind of looking at from our most recent. So the DO levels, I mean, we're all very good on all the tanks. So yeah, that's oxygen exposure is humongous. So minimizing that any way you can is really key for this style.
Yeah, absolutely. You wouldn't mind sharing what those levels are? I'm just curious.
Yeah, sure. So we canned 3 different tanks. The first bright tank, it was a double IPA, and the bright tank DO was 27.2.
Okay.
The second bright tank was 32, which is also a double IPA.
These are ppms, right?
I suspect it does not have. I suspect that's what it is.
Yeah.
And then the last one was actually a beer we spunded and we carbed in the fermenter, so it had never been opened, and it was 13.9. So there is still a tiny bit of oxygen, no matter what you do. All
right. So when it comes to kind of purging this vessel, how do you tell what's purged? PPB. Sorry, not ppm. You're right. Thanks, Rick. How do you determine purged enough? I know we've had some clients where they've thought they had fermentation flavor problems, and it actually was a DO problem in their bright tank, because they thought they were getting rid of all the DO inside their bright tank. It turns out they weren't. How do you guys control that? Is it just like some breweries go really high pressure for a short period of time, but do it like 6 or so times? And it's an extreme case, but I know of one client that does it that way. Some people will try to slowly purge the tank over a long period of time. How do you guys handle this?
Yeah, that's another thing that we've just sort of kind of developed a process over the years of doing this. We just kind of have like a pressure I set the regulator to, a certain amount of time we purge the tank for. We'll typically let it build up pressure, completely vent it a few times. Yeah, so there's no real way to quantify it. Unfortunately, it's just kind of like by feel. When we think okay, it's been purged enough, and then we're like, okay, purge it a little bit more.
Yeah, I know. I enjoy the breweries that have the ability to have DO meters, but that's not always a practicality. Mm-hmm. That's usually it's a luxury item, not always practical.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's not a reality for us.
There's been a few questions here that I don't know if it makes sense to touch on this. What temperature do you guys whirlpool at? I know some breweries have tried whirlpooling to speak Fahrenheit, but at like 180 Fahrenheit or so. Do you guys do a pre-cooling for your whirlpool, or is it just kind of at boiling temperatures or near boiling temperature?
It's just we turn off the heating elements, so we're electric. So we just turn off the heating elements and then just start whirlpooling. So it's near boiling temperatures.
Okay. I also meant to ask, are you guys a 60-minute boil or a 90-minute boil?
Typically, it's just a 60-minute boil. Sometimes if the pre-boil gravity is a little on the low side, we'll boil longer, but 60 is standard. Okay.
Cool. I have a few questions, just kind of wrap some little bits up about hops and haze, and then I think we're going to open it up to the group.
Sure.
You mentioned that you guys have the luxury hops that you guys work with, your Citra, Mosaics, Nelson Sauvin, which is my favorite hop, Galaxies, Hallertau Blancs. How do you go about choosing which one? Is it more so like I like this one, therefore we're going to use it, or is it how do you go about choosing which hops you're going to brew with, or designing recipes? How do you choose which hop you want to use?
Yeah, it's definitely a little bit of like, this is my favorite hop and we have it now. So something like Nelson, we don't have under contract. So just whenever it pops up on spot, we buy it and then we like use it basically right away because we're excited to use it. Otherwise, like I said before, when we choose our dry hop quantities are kind of set by, you know, bags of hops. Like if we're dry hopping a standard size batch of double IPA, we do 2 bags. So lots of times we'll pick 2 different hops and then just ones we think will kind of pair together. Or other times it's been like, okay, we'll pick this hop and this hop. That's a combination we've never done before. So let's try that and see how that works. So it's a little bit of kind of both. Yeah.
So there's a little bit of experimentation going on for a lot of this recipe development.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So coming up, we have a beer that's dry hopped with Citra and Sabro. It's only the second time we've ever used Sabro. So we didn't want to use it only by itself. So we like kind of paired it with a hop that we know really well, that we know it's going to be good. So just kind of that is sort of part of the way we choose the hops sometimes.
So that's kind of a risk mitigation strategist. Let's put a little bit of good in there so we can buffer out something we don't know if it's going to be good or not.
Yeah, and like I said before, how we were never going to be kind of the first ones to try a new hop. So like we know Sabro is good. We've had enough beers with it, so like we're confident that the beer is, you know, you're not going to end up with a bad beer because you're putting Sabro in it. So
yeah, exactly. It's I have a disdain for the hop summit because sometimes it's lovely and sometimes it's just garlic, I find. So I'm always, it's not one of those scenarios where sometimes the batch is good, sometimes it's not.
Yeah, there definitely are hops that certain people are averse to, but then there's, you know, most of the sort of standard IPA hops nobody's going to dislike, really.
No, not really. I do want to point, this is something that we chatted about this is about a month ago or so, right before everything kind of went weird. Have you noticed that certain hops contribute more or less to haze? There's a lot of anecdotal evidence out there, or a lot of anecdotes out there saying that things like Galaxy are much more prominent to producing haze, or that if you dry hop with them, they're going to give you a much more kind of rich mouthfeel to them and less bitterness. Do you have any kind of anecdotes like that you'd be sharing? Kind of, you know, this hop tends to do this thing, this hop tends to do this other side benefit.
Yeah, there's definitely certain hops that people refer to more as haze positive than others.
Yep.
So Galaxy is definitely one that we found makes the haziest beers. Whereas something like Mosaic is on the opposite end of the spectrum. You'll get it'll still be hazy, but it'll be a much lighter haze. Like with Galaxy, you get like a very, very opaque beer, to borderline murky sometimes. So yeah there definitely is. Oh yeah, exactly. So there definitely is a variability in the haze level based on your hop selection.
All right. Are there any other hops that kind of come out that have kind of other external properties to them? Like I've heard some people say that, like, you know, some people get the whole Citra cat pee thing, or where it's basically off their sensitivity to thiols and things like that. Or some people, like you think you mentioned Sabro, that, you know, some people just don't like that hop. Do you ever stay away from things like that, or notice any kind of oddities about any of those kind of luxury hops?
No, I've never got the cat pee thing with Citra. I know definitely some people do. We've noticed that for some reason, some people sort of have a preconceived notion about certain hops that they don't like. So one of the beers we did recently, we specifically didn't tell people what hops were in it because one of the hops was a hop that some people for some reason think they don't like. So that was kind of fun that way. But for the most part, no, it was Vic Secret actually.
Ah, okay, I understand that. All right.
Do you not like it?
No, at least I don't think I do.
I bet you probably would actually.
All right. I'll try it. I won't knock it. So yeah, I've found it very interesting how some people do have these kind of odd anecdotes regarding certain hops and kind of these other properties to it. You know, a lot of brewers just think of this hop equals this flavor, but I have found that oftentimes there's kind of other elements to them. I know there's been a little bit of research on this stuff, which we're going to share at a later point when we do the kind of the science of haze webinar. But there is some evidence behind the whole Galaxy equals more haze, Mosaic equals less haze phenomenon.
Right. Yep.
There is data on that. We know that to be factual.
And also, when you talk about dry hopping with something like cryo hops versus like regular pellets, cryo hops will produce significantly less haze in the finished beer if you just do cryo.
Okay, I'm glad you brought cryo up, because I want to ask about your thoughts on the difference between cryo hops, normal hops, and on top of this, hop burn. Because I've heard people talk about both sides of this, saying that cryo hops give you less hop burn, and also some people say that normal hops give you less hop burn. What have you guys found? Have you found anything in regards to hop burn, or kind of different formats of different types of hops, and the benefits or cons?
So what a lot of people refer to as hop burn, I kind of always think as like too much yeast in suspension of the beer, and maybe some hop oils clinging to that yeast. So that's sort of what I think as hop burn is actually beers that are too yeasty, really.
Okay. That could make sense, because yeast cells are known to, push iso-alpha acids on the outside of the cell, and that could be the kind of bitter astringency.
I think so. A lot of times beers, when you do have a little bit more yeast in suspension, they actually seems to increase the hoppiness. But at some point, you sort of do get that back of the throat bite that people refer to as hop burn. So for us, like, we just try to get as much yeast out of the beer as possible. So what you're drinking is not like, it's hazy, but it's not hazy because of yeast in suspension.
Yeah, it's more of a protein polyphenol thing opposed to cells.
Exactly.
In regards to cryo hops versus normal hops, what do you guys prefer?
So we very rarely use cryo hops, actually. And if we do use them, it's always in combination with like regular pellets. So we did a triple IPA. That was the last one we did, actually. I think it was last fall. So it was all mosaic, but we used a combination of cryo and regular pellets.
Okay. And what's the reason for kind of not? So some brewers love the whole, like, they get in the cryo hop train, so to speak. Why not? Why not?
So one thing, like I did just mention, if you dry hop only with cryo, you're not going to get the same haze level.
Okay.
Actually, oftentimes the beer is like significantly brighter, like almost to the point of not being hazy. And I find also if you use too much cryo, the beer becomes like really abrasive, which kind of is something we try to avoid at all costs. I think the one thing about our IPAs is they're like very kind of smooth, chuggable almost, and like we really try to avoid that abrasive hop profile. And I think if you use cryo too heavily, you get that.
Yeah, I've heard, this is a weird thing. I've heard this on both sides, saying that too much normal hops equals abrasiveness and too much cryo equals abrasiveness. It seems to be, there isn't any sort of linear consistency on this. I find it quite perplexing. You did mention.
I would say we've never found that with too much regular hop pellets. Like, we've dry hopped like at some pretty crazy rates, and we haven't really found the abrasiveness to come from that.
Yeah. The other value that a lot of people chalk up for hop burn and kind of abrasiveness is temperature at which dry hop occurs. So if you guys are dry hopping at a colder temperature, that would make a lot of sense, that you're getting a smoother kind of hop character from it.
Right.
I meant to ask this as well. How long are you typically allowing that dry hop to sit on the beer? So you're dry hopping, I think it's day 5 or 6.
So we dry hop on day 6, and a standard dry hop for us is 4 days.
Okay, and then are you just transferring the beer to the bright tank after that, or is it how are you removing the beer from the hops, or the hops from the beer, I guess?
Yeah, so during dry hop we rouse twice, the second day and the third day, and then the fourth day. At the end of the fourth day, we'll start cold crashing. So we'll cold crash the tank for 3 days, dumping hops every day to get as much as we can out, and then at
just
that
off
point,
the bottom part?
Just off the bottom, yeah.
And you're just rousing via CO2 injection on the bottom of the tank?
Yeah, exactly. We just blast CO2 up through the bottom of the cone. Okay.
So some breweries do this this hop recirculation method, where they'll add hops to the tank, and then they'll hook up a small pump, usually a peristaltic pump, so nothing that has a motor in it, so they don't get shear stress. And they'll pull off the bottom, then inject back into the racking arm to kind of recirculate, almost replicate like a meshless hop torpedo that you see for Stone or Sierra Nevada. Yep. Is the goal here to kind of help replicate that on a smaller scale?
Yeah, it's just to get the hops back in suspension. Like, we don't have any way of doing that. Like, our brewery pump is just a regular pump, so we can't do that way. So yeah, it's just to get the hops back up in suspension.
All right.
Get
Yeah, that makes tons of sense. Like, one of the things that there's been, we'll talk about this in a webinar at a later point in regards to haze, but there's been a lot of research in regards to contact time, extraction time, surface area to volume ratios, and all that stuff for hop extraction. One last thing I want to kind of mention or ask you before we talk about the haze, like kind of wrap up haze. Have you ever looked at reusing hops? What some breweries have experimented with doing is, say, taking their dry hop from batch A and then using that as the whirlpool hop for the next batch, or bringing a certain brand of beer onto the dry hop from a prior batch. The idea here being that you can get more flavor out of these hops. Just because they've been used once doesn't mean they're done, so to speak. And as we kind of alluded to earlier, hops are expensive. You don't look at your bill. And as we're going to get to, hops also eat up a lot of volume in your, a lot of yield for your product. Have you guys ever experimented with that?
It's not something we've ever done, but it is something we have talked about before. I think it's just a matter of kind of getting two beers lined up that it makes sense. Like the one thing we've talked about doing is maybe having a triple IPA. Once we transfer it out of the tank, pushing something like a pale ale back into that tank with all the leftover hops and just making like a crazy hoppy pale ale. And even if you're getting significantly less like hoppiness out of what's left, you're still going to have like a sufficiently hopped pale ale. It's just not something that's ever lined up for us, but I mean, we would probably try it at some point if we can.
All right. One other thing, just kind of help clarify. So on day 6, you said you're taking yeast, correct?
Yeah, day 6 we'll pull yeast for reuse, dump the rest, and then start the dry hop.
So you are dumping all the excess yeast off that tank at that time.
Yeah, so once we have enough to pitch for the next beer, then we'll just get rid of get all the yeast that we possibly can out of the tank.
Okay, cool. When it comes to kind of haze, what we've already kind of mentioned that you like certain hops definitely give. Galaxy particularly gives more haze. You guys use a large amount of oat malt and things like that for your grain bill in order to push haze. Is there anything else you guys do to try and really, crank the haze out? You guys are known for making hazies. Like, is it when it comes to kind of control points in the process, what do you guys focus on?
So haze for me is much more of like a byproduct of the style. What I really love about this style is the soft texture. So we don't really worry about haze. We don't really worry about like producing haze. It just kind of is one of those things that happens when you brew in this style. Okay.
So the kind of the oats and maybe a bit of the wheat, the dextrin malts, using kind of these luxury hops, all those things should on their own yield plenty of haze.
Yeah, I don't even know how much oats actually do. It's something we've been meaning to play around with, is do an IPA just purely 2-row and just see what the difference is. We haven't been able to get around to it yet, but I suspect it's going to be pretty similar in terms of haze level, maybe a little bit lighter, but I don't think the oats play a huge role.
There's an argument to be made here, and this is I'm not going to get too into the weeds on this because we are going to talk about this at a later point. But there's a weird interaction on your palate that happens when IBUs, so the bitter compounds for isoalpha acids from hops, they bind with proteins, and when they're bound to proteins, it's much harder for your palate to observe them. That's part of the reason why Nipas are thought to taste smooth, is that any sort of bitterness that is present is actually more difficult for your tongue to sense because it has been previously bound to this protein, and the protein is derived from either wheat, rye, oats, things that have a much higher protein content to it. I've wondered the same thing though that you wondered aloud. How much of this is just the hops versus how much of it is the malts. I'm very curious about this. I want to know the results of that if and when you guys do that.
Yeah. I think it's mostly the yeast and the hops.
All right.
One thing that's kind of neat about our beer is prior to dry hopping, it's almost crystal clear. Recently, we had a batch of beer that we had to delay a week, so we just instead of dry hopping it on day 6, we just left it in the tank and dry hopped it on day 13. And I pulled a sample before dry hopping, and the beer was crystal clear, like you could read through it. And then we dry hopped it as normal. Yeah, we dry hopped it as normal, and then post dry hopping, it was completely opaque.
That's really cool. That's not what I would expect to see at all.
Yeah.
Huh. All right. Noted. That's kind of a cool little tidbit to get from that.
And
One
then
thing
and that's that. So I was to say that's why yeast is important, because certain yeasts won't do that. So if we'd have fermented that with something like a California ale yeast, it might have got like a little bit a light haze, but it certainly wouldn't have become opaque post dry hopping.
So this is a perfect segue into my next question I have for you. So you guys have made kind of an experimented with a West Coast IPA. So what do you guys do different from a West Coast to an East Coast? Like what variances is there? Is it just hop bill and yeast strain, or is it, what do you think the control mechanisms to go from one style to the other?
Yeah, yeast strain is the big one. I think doing a West Coast IPA, you want to choose a more classic West Coast yeast. So for us, we just use California ale yeast. I mean, you can't really go wrong making a West Coast IPA with California ale yeast, right? So that's the big thing. Otherwise, like I said, the last double IPA we did was 2-row and dextrose only. We made it a little bit more bitter, as West Coast IPAs tend to be. We still didn't want it to be too bitter, but we boiled hops a little bit more. And then otherwise, we treated it exactly the same.
All right. The last couple questions before we get into the group's questions, and this is something that from a commercial standpoint, and I'm sure you're aware, this becomes a big issue. Losses. So I know some breweries are going up to, just due to dry hop losses, they're losing, up to 15% or more of their total batch's volume just due to dry hops. And for the reason this is that when you add dry hops to the tank, they're dry. There's no liquid in them, so they absorb all this liquid around them, and that you can't extract the beer to that unless you have a centrifuge. Like there's been some breweries where the ROI, the return on investment of a centrifuge, which is a several $100,000 piece of equipment, has been months based on the increases in yield they're getting out of their product. I'm curious what you guys notice in regards to yields and things like that, and kind of how you balance that. Do you worry about yields for these things, or is it really about just kind of pushing out the best product possible? Because most breweries are kind of struggling with this, where it's a line between the two. I've even heard some breweries suggest that this is the reason why hard seltzers became a thing, because you weren't making money on your Ipas, so you had to make something that you made tons of money on.
Yeah, it's definitely something we're conscious of. Like you want to get as much beer as possible in like the final product, but at the same time, we don't want to sacrifice quality to do that. So I can tell you kind of what our yields typically are. So like I said, our batch size is 600 liters. And so for an IPA or double IPA that we're dry hopping with 10 kilograms, best case scenario, we get 500 out of it. Usually we don't. Usually it's more between 450 and 480. I would say. So
that's with about a 4 kilo dry hop, you said?
10 kilo dry hop for 600 liters.
So you're losing
which is not a small dry hop, but yeah. So that would be.
So roughly for every kilo you're adding, you're losing 10 liters of product.
Yeah, at least.
Okay, that's about right what I've heard, but that's huge.
Yeah.
Do you do anything to try and mitigate these things? Like this is part of the reason why I've heard people go towards cryo, because cryo is a more concentrated form of the hop. Therefore, you're going to be losing less amount of hops. So you could be losing less beer per heck because you're adding a concentrated form of the substance. You mentioned the haze portion on this, so I understand why you wouldn't do that. But is there anything else that kind of factors into your decision making regarding losses?
Like I said, we just try to minimize them anywhere we can, like all the way back to like filling the tank as full as we possibly can to start, like knowing, you're going to lose X amount of beer. So then at the end of the day, I mean, it's one of those things we accept.
Okay. And for those kind of in the chat, I see a few things going on. The reason you're losing volume is kind of like the equivalent of like when you're making coffee. If I add 1 liter of water into my French press, I'm not going to get 1 liter of coffee out. The coffee beans themselves absorb a handful of liquid. Same thing happens with hops. You're not able to get that liquid back out, at least not with any sort of other mechanical separation techniques. So you're going to be losing volume regardless. There's no way around it.
And another thing that happens is despite dumping hops as much as possible from the fermenter, you still get hops that go all the way up the side of the cone of the fermenter. So in order to actually get beer out of the fermenter without pulling too much hops, we have to flip the racking arm completely straight up. So you're probably leaving a fair bit of beer. Well, you are leaving a fair bit of beer in the tank that way also. So it's not just the absorption. It's just like sludgy beer at the bottom of the tank that you don't want in the bright tank.
Yeah, and this is why you see some breweries starting to look at the whole idea of repurposing hops. If I have say a 10 hect tank that has 1.5 hex of kind of hop sludge beer in the bottom of it, and I bring 10 hex more of a pale ale on that, I'm not losing volume on that because those hops have already reabsorbed. They've already absorbed liquid. So exactly, I'm just infusing flavor into this pale ale without having any additional losses. Like there's one brewery that's kind of in our kind of both of our areas that's essentially doing their pale ale. So they're dry hopping their pale ale, then they're bringing another beer on top of the spent hop cake of that, and then they're taking that secondary beer, it's usually a saison or something like that, off of it, and then they're bringing a Brett beer on top of that. So they're essentially using the hops or fruits or things like that. Do it for a whole bunch of different ingredients, but 3 times to try and crank out as much usage from those hops without getting losses, which is really neat.
Like I said, it's definitely something we want to play around with. Fruit, we have done that several times, but we've never done it with hops yet.
Yeah. I've actually had a few beers where I've liked the second gen use of the fruit better than the first gen, but this is a conversation for a later point.
Yeah.
Richard has done a few beers like that, and they've been much better on second gen, in my opinion. So yeah, that's we've covered a lot of ground. We covered a lot of things. If you could just kind of give everyone kind of a quick rundown as to the things that you would recommend they focus on in regards to making this style of beer. I think that'll be kind of a good way for us to kind of cap all these different topics off, and then we can jump into the questions.
Okay. So right off the bat, I think yeast selection is big. So choosing the right yeast. If somebody was buying yeast from you guys, and they should be, I would say something like Foggy London is a fantastic choice for this style of beer. If you want to go the dry yeast route, SO4 works also very well. We actually always keep a brick in our cold room as a backup, and we've done several IPAs with it in the past, and it does work really well also. Next, I think just for this style of beer, process is so humongous. Just finding out really what works with your system and just dialing that in. Like what works for us might not necessarily work for somebody else. So it's just a lot of trial and error. Grain bill, keep it simple. Like we said, like you don't need to put 5 or 6 different malts in an IPA. 2 or 3 or 4, even 1 can work really well. Hops, choose good hops and take care of them. Taking care of the hops is the biggest thing. Like, dry hopping with only freshly opened bags of hops has been a huge change for us. Like we didn't start out doing that, and switching to solely doing that has been one of the biggest improvements. And just minimizing oxygen exposure at every step has been huge too.
All right, awesome. Yeah, that's exactly what I would kind of expect. Making sure your process is key. Make sure you choose the right yeast strain, and making sure you keep oxygen away from this thing as much as possible seem to be kind of the keys for it.
Yep.
So we're going to go through. There's a handful of good questions here. There are some that we're going to probably focus on at a later point when we talk about the science behind this. But we'll start walking through. So the first question, this is from Nick. So long as good practices in regards to oxygen are in place, would you recommend against bottle conditioning this style? So bottle conditioning in New England style IPA.
So I think as long as you can really eliminate or minimize oxygen exposure, you can definitely bottle condition it. The challenge with bottle conditioning is obviously you have, a couple weeks wait time before it's carbonated. So you're already drinking a beer that's not quite as fresh. But I think as long as you can keep oxygen exposure down, you can definitely make a very good example of this style, bottle conditioning it.
All right. I know if you go like kind of the Sierra Nevada route where they'll cap, or they'll, like during fermentation, they'll seal the tank off or anything, kind of what you guys are doing, actually exactly what you guys are doing. And then they'll just add a little bit of carbonation, a little bit of sugar inside their bottles to help prime the beer up a little bit. Obviously, this requires much more equipment, but they use it as a way to scrub off any oxygen that is picked up during packaging. I could see that being a good method for this, but I wouldn't probably go any further than that.
If that's your limitation, having to bottle condition a beer, you can definitely do it. But I think the challenge is definitely going to be oxygen exposure.
Yeah. I would agree. Yeah. The next question is, when making a NIPA with Kveik strains, have you guys made a NIPA with Kveik?
We have not. We have never once used Kveik, actually.
Okay. there's some research that's being done, not research, like anecdotal. People are trialing it. But the question is, when making a NIPA with Kveik strains, should you be concerned with any sort of haze stability when fermenting at warmer temperatures than normal? I probably would. This is probably a question that we're going to talk a lot more about at a later point. But you're probably going to want to have a heavier hand when it comes to like oats, rye, spelt, things like that. Jeremy, you wouldn't happen to know, for, again, this is just rough numbers, but how much of your grain bills are roughly not barley? Like there's dextrin malt and there's base malt. That oat malt fraction, how much roughly is that?
I don't know percentages, but I could give you a typical grain bill for a double IPA, and we can kind of quickly figure that out if you want.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
So our standard double IPA grain bill for 6 hex is 6.5 sacks of 2-row.
Okay.
It's 2 sacks of malted oats.
Okay.
It's 1 sack of dextrin malt.
Okay.
And then 25 pounds of dextrose.
25 pounds? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So that's roughly, so you're roughly about 20%, give or take.
Yeah. So that,
depending you calculate it.
Yeah. So an IPA, we do 1 sack of oat malt. So IPA would have significantly less oat malt in it. Okay,
cool. So yeah, you're probably working between like 10 to 15%, roughly, maybe closer to 15% for an IPA, and closer to 20% for doubles.
Yeah, anywhere between 10 to 20% in general.
All right. Nick, we're going to answer that question with regards to Kveiks at a later point. There's a little bit more to kind of work through on that.
Yeah, so I'm not the best person to answer Kveik-related questions.
Do you use one strain of yeast or a blend? And I know the answer to this, but have you guys experimented with blends of yeast for this?
We haven't. So we just use a single strain. Obviously, there are rumors about a certain U.S. brewery that uses a blend of yeast to make these. Yep. So that's something that we've kind of talked about potentially playing around with at some point. But no, to this point, we've only ever used a single strain.
Yeah, and the if you go to the Q&A webinar we did, we did some investigatory work on that and figured out what strains that brewery is working with. You can go over there and find the link for where we posted that. It's rather cool. They are using a blend of three yeast strains, and one of those is a Weizen.
Oh, really? So that is something that's actually confirmed?
Yeah, that is confirmed.
Oh, cool.
And it's a biotransformation thing. The interesting thing for that is the kinetics behind the haze in that beer are different than the kinetics behind probably your beers.
Okay.
So that is the particulate in those beers, from my understanding, could be slightly wrong on this, but my understanding is that the haze in those beers is much more yeast derived than it is protein polyphenol complex derived. So it's closer to in haze to say a Hefeweizen than it is in haze to a standard NIPA.
Right. Okay.
Can there be too much hop material where it becomes detrimental to the beer?
I think if it's at the point where you're getting hop material in your glass, then it's probably too much, or you didn't do a very good job separating it out. But no, I don't think we found that. Like I said, we've gone up to 20 kilogram dry hop for 6 hex of beer, and in the end result, I don't think was too much hops. I mean, it was a waste of hops. It was a terrible yield, but it wasn't certainly detrimental to the beer. Okay.
This is kind of a question that came up beforehand, but I think it's worth revisiting. How do you evaluate a hop blend before brewing? And how do you determine the amounts that go into whirlpool versus dry hop? And I'd kind of add on to this, how do you determine, or have you realized that certain hops work better in dry hop versus whirlpool?
So early on, we used to play around with whirlpooling a lot of different hops. And I'm a firm believer that really the big fit, it's all about the dry hops. It kind of almost doesn't matter what you're whirlpooling. So I would say 90% of our hoppy beer gets Columbus in the kettle.
Really? And Columbus at whirlpool?
Yeah.
So this is, I'm kind of interested that you brought that up, because there's Columbus and Chinook have almost been having this kind of low-key renaissance when it comes to hoppy beers. because the way in which kind of hop processing tech has improved, those hops went from kind of being boring, you know, kind of sea hop-esque thing with Chinook being a bit more piney. Now having like, I've had Chinook that is just wonderful pineapple bombs and things like that. Like, have you noticed that those hops actually do bring some things forward, or are you strictly just kind of using those as kind of like a background palette?
I think both of those hops can be fantastic, but they're so variable. Obviously, something like that, not being proprietary, it can be grown anywhere, and there's fantastic examples of those hops, and there's also versions that are just kind of gross, to be honest. So for us, the reason for Columbus and the Whirlpool is just it's pretty cost-effective hop, and then when you're talking putting like 2.5 kilograms in the Whirlpool and then 10 kilograms in the dry hop, whatever you dry hop with is going to really overpower what's in the Whirlpool. So that's why we kind of think it almost doesn't really matter. You kind of just want like some generic hoppiness in the Whirlpool and that bitterness.
Okay. Is that something that I know some brewers do like a 50-50 split of Whirlpool to dry hop. Have you guys found that you do get much more oomph by moving things away from the Whirlpool and into the dry hop?
I think I touched on this a little bit earlier.
You did, yeah.
Bitterness is something that we really need to be conscious of because of the water. So even whirlpooling too much hops, we've ended up with beers that are too bitter. So the amount we whirlpool is really just like the maximum we can put in without making beer that's too bitter.
Gotcha. All right. That makes tons of sense, especially based on that water. Like I've brewed with that water. It's not not pleasant.
No, it's not. I don't even drink it.
No,
unless it's in beer form.
Yeah, I live in Hamilton, which for anyone who's not in the area, Hamilton's a bit about an hour south of Guelph, and Cambridge is about 20-30 minutes west of Guelph. And Guelph is hard water. Cambridge has harder water. It's kind of brutal. How relevant do you think oil percentage is to hop selection and haze?
There's not something we really ever think about, to be honest.
Okay. I know some brewers are really trying to look at hop oil percentage as kind of like the IBU equivalent unit. Like, you know, we can use alpha acid content to figure out IBU calculations. I know some people are looking at oil percentage to try and scale that up to like an oil flavor unit or something like that. So I wonder if that's where that's come. Luke, there is some people trying to figure that out.
Yes, not really something we've really ever looked at.
Okay. I'm just trying to go through here, and I think we've answered most of these. What's your normal grain to glass time?
So typically, I would say 16 days.
Okay.
That's partly based on schedule. We could probably do 14 days, really, if we really needed to. But yeah, 16, 17 is standard.
So we've talked about the first 6 days of that. Can you run us through the last 10 so that we talk about the first 6 of the 16 days? What are the latter 10? Yeah,
so the first 6, and then the next 4 will be dry hop. 3 days after that will be cold crash. Get it into the bright tank. It would typically be carbonated by the next day, but we use that's usually our brew day. So we kind of use that brew day just to dial in the carbonation and an excuse to drink beer from the bright tank. And then either the following day or the day after we'll package. So that's typically Wednesday or Thursday. And then we open on Friday. So then be on sale for the first time on Friday.
All right. And so kind of a follow-up question.
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. I was a follow-up question to that. What from a carbonation standpoint, what are you shooting for?
Somewhere around like 2.4, 2.5 volumes typically.
Okay, so it's kind of nothing crazy. I know some people really want to. Some people try to push it on the low end, and some people try to push it on the high end.
Yeah, no, we just kind of go right in the middle. We actually canned a double IPA recently that was at 2.7, kind of by accident, but no real ill effects. Still drinks fantastically. So yeah.
I know you guys really aren't really in this issue because your beer I'm guessing is usually gone pretty quick. Based on what I know about your guys' facility, but do you notice that after a certain age the beer starts losing? Like how soon do you kind of see those flavors lock in for?
So we actually find initially the beer tends to get better. I find our beer peaks at about maybe 2 or 3 weeks post packaging.
Okay.
And then it's really at its peak for a few weeks after that point, and then kind of slowly starts to fade. I've opened cans that we've canned maybe 6 months ago, and like they've held up well. Obviously, the hops have significantly faded, but there hasn't been really any ill effects to the beer itself, other than just this much more subtle hoppiness. So I would say probably about if you're drinking one of our beers a month after packaging, it's going to be probably at its peak.
All right. And I think we'll kind of finish on this one because this is kind of a nice kind of side subject for us to go through. What do you guys do? Do you focus on anything for head retention? Like when you're trying to get haze typically is associated right alongside, like all the proteins associated with haze are also associated with head retention for the beer. So do you guys ever notice anything positively or negatively in regards to retention?
We don't really do anything specific to try to get better head retention. I just think, yeah, exactly. Like a lot of the characteristics or a lot of the things that are going into these beers are a very positive thing for good head retention. Like when you're dry hopping that much, you have so much oil in the beer that you're going to get great head retention anyway. So we typically find they do have great head retention, but no, it's not really something we ever sort of tried to achieve.
Okay. And there's actually one or two things that just kind of like rapid fire questions for here.
Sure.
Any experience with hop products like hop extracts or things like that to help with losses?
We played around with hop extracts in the kettle a little bit early on, but one of those things we found is because we're putting so little in the kettle that from a loss perspective, the kettle is not really where it happens. So using hop extract there didn't really make much of a difference for us. And beyond that, like I know there's a few new hop products like the name's escaping me right now, but not really something we've played around with yet.
All right. Do you filter your beer? I'm pretty sure the answer to this is no.
No, not at all.
All right. When you're vorloffing, do you vorloff the wort to clarity, or do you keep the runoff pretty hazy?
We run one bucket. That's our vorloff. Fill a bucket, dump it back on top of the mash, and then that's it.
A 20-liter bucket, I'm guessing.
20-liter bucket, yeah. 20-liter vorloff, and then right into the kettle. We run it through a wort grant first.
Okay.
So like any grain that gets through the false bottom ends up whirlpooling in the wort grant. So we just kind of leave that behind there and then just run it directly into the kettle.
Some people have argued that that we'll get into this when we talk about the science behind all this stuff, but there is a fatty acid component. There's argued to be a fatty acid component to the haze, where fatty acids are kind of semi-soluble lipids, essentially, that are thought to help promote haze, especially when they bind to polyphenols or tannins from the hops. They're usually associated with dry hop. And one of the ways in which we can remove these things, or we know we can remove them this way, is by heavily vorloffing. It's like one of the reasons that we want lager wort to be crystal clear in the vorloff is often because it knocks down all of these fatty acid portions. So I'm not surprised that you're doing that. I'm not surprised that you're minimally vorloffing.
Right.
Especially by the style of beer, you're probably keeping a lot of those fatty acids inside of there that are going to help stabilize that haze.
Yeah, probably. Somebody in the comments just mentioned incognito. That's what I was trying to think. No, that's something that we would like to play around with at some point, but we haven't. So, yeah, that's what I was trying to think of.
Have you ever experimented with things like xanthan gum or other things to stabilize haze?
No, that's not something we've ever played around with. We found like brewing the beers the way we do, you get a pretty stable haze. We've played around with different yeasts in the past, and then found actually we used Vermont at one point, and we really struggled to actually keep the beers hazy with that. But with our go-to yeast now, that's not really an issue.
Yeah. The last two questions. What temperature do you cold crash?
As cold as we can get it. So depends kind of how far the tank is away from the glycol chiller, but we can normally get it right to pretty close to 0 Celsius. All right. And the final question I have. The bright tanks we can get a little bit below 0, which is nice because they're the closest to the chiller.
The last question I have for you is not in the questions, but why the name Barncat?
There's no real good story behind it. Just so I've been homebrewing for a long time, and one of my good friends is a graphic designer. He actually does all our logos and artwork. If you've seen any of our can labels or bottle labels, he does all that stuff. So we used to work together, and he would just always say, as soon as you can come up with a brewery name, I'll design you a logo. So like one time just kind of we were tossing around ideas, Barncat kind of stuck, and then like the next day he had that logo design, like the main one with the angry cat kind of snarling. Like he did that probably back in 2013 or 14. So just kind of something that just, so that was like when I was homebrewing, I was calling my beer Barncat. So we just kind of went with it.
That's wicked. That's actually pretty cool. Yeah, and one of the people in the comments said, like, Barncat. I always thought it was Brett beers and things like that. I kind of, when the first time I heard of this, your brewery's name, that's kind of what I thought too. Like, just Brett sour beers and funky beers and things like that.
Well, we definitely do. We do those too, for sure.
Yeah, like we've been talking a lot about hazies and things like that today, but you guys do make things that aren't hazies.
Yes, we do. We do.
Yeah.
We do a lot of sour, funky beers too, and a lot of big stouts, and we're starting to do a lot more lagers.
Yeah, The Barncat is not just hazies. They do other stuff.
No, we do some other things.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much it for it. Is there anything else you want to kind of end on?
I think we pretty much touched on everything I want to talk about. So, I mean, if that's, I think it's a good place to stop.
Yeah, I think it's pretty good. Awesome. Thanks everyone for joining us. We're going to be posting this in the near future. If you have any questions about this, you can email me at nate@escarpmentlabs.com. I can probably answer any additional questions for you there. And look, if you want to learn more about this, look forward to another webinar about this in the near future about the science of haze. We were going to give that talk at a conference that was unfortunately canceled. Shocking. So we do have that kind of canned, so we're just waiting for kind of a good time to launch it. Hope everyone stays safe. Thanks, Jeremy, again for spending some time with us. And
yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah. We'll see you guys soon. Thanks.